Hello there, and welcome to Cosmic Slumber. Tonight, once again, we are setting aside the usual 100 quiet facts and settling instead into a single long, gentle story, the kind best listened to with your eyes already closed and your blankets already pulled up warm around your shoulders. Tonight's tale is told in the old style, the way legends were once shared around northern hearths on the longest, darkest nights of winter, passed down by firelight from one generation to the next. It is an original tale, woven in that same old spirit rather than copied from any single ancient source. So think of it less as history and more as the kind of story a grandmother might have told, softened and reshaped by 100 retellings, about a small fishing village, a long and frightening darkness, and the night its people are said to have reached all the way up and touched the stars. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. It helps other sleepy minds find their way here, too, one quiet story at a time. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let your shoulders soften. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your breathing slow, deep and even, as we drift together into the tale of the village that touched the stars. Let's begin. Long ago, in a fjord so far north that the sun itself seemed reluctant to visit more than a few hours each winter day, there was a small village called Solvik, which meant, in the old tongue, the Bay of Sun. This was, the villagers themselves admitted with a wry, fond humour, rather an optimistic name for a place that spent nearly half of every year wrapped in darkness, but the name had been given by the village's very first settlers, many generations before, and no one since had ever felt quite right about changing it. Solvik sat nestled between steep, snow-capped mountains and the cold, deep waters of the fjord, its houses built low and sturdy against the wind, their turf roofs green in summer and white in winter, smoke curling steadily from every chimney through the long, dark months. The villagers fished the fjord's icy waters, tended small hardy flocks on the rocky hillsides, and told stories, as northern people always have, to fill the long winter evenings when the sun disappeared for weeks at a stretch and there was little else to do but sit close to the fire and wait, together, for its return. This particular story, the one told most often and most fondly of all Solvik's many tales, was always saved for the very darkest night of the year, the night the old villagers called the long hush, when the sun had been gone longest and the whole world felt, as it always did at that particular point in winter, as though it might never quite manage to come back at all. It was told, on the night this story concerns, by an old woman named Freydis, who had told it every single year for as long as the youngest children in the village could remember, sitting in her usual place by the great hearth in the village's central hall, her voice low and warm, her eyes bright with the reflected firelight, while the children of Solvik gathered close around her feet, wrapped in blankets and pressed shoulder to shoulder for warmth. Long, long ago, Freydis began, exactly as she always began. Before your grandmother's grandmothers first built their houses on this shore, Solvik faced a winter darker and longer than any that had come before or has come since. The sun did not simply grow scarce that particular year, the way it always does in the deep winter months. It vanished entirely, for reasons no one in the village could properly explain, leaving the whole fjord wrapped in a darkness so complete that even the oldest villagers, who had weathered many hard winters, began to grow properly afraid. The children, exactly as they always did at this part of the story, leaned in a little closer, their eyes wide in the firelight, though every one of them already knew, from many previous tellings, precisely how the tale would eventually turn out. The village's food stores began to run low, Freydis continued, for without the sun's pale winter light, even the small amount of fishing the villagers usually managed through the darkest months became impossible, the fjord's waters black and unreadable beneath a sky that offered no light at all to fish by. The flocks on the hillside grew thin and frightened, unable to find their way properly across the snow without even the faint grey light of an ordinary winter day to guide them. And the villagers themselves, huddled together in their turf-roofed houses, began to whisper, fearfully, that perhaps the sun had abandoned them entirely, and would never return. It was into this frightened, darkened village, Freydis went on, her voice dropping slightly, drawing the listening children in even closer, that a young weaver named Astrid found herself unable to sleep one particular night, deep in the very heart of that endless darkness. She was, by all accounts, an unremarkable young woman in most ways, skilled with a loom but no more clever or brave than any other villager her age. But on this particular sleepless night, restless and frightened along with everyone else in Solvik, she rose quietly from her bed and walked, alone, out onto the frozen shore of the fjord, simply needing, she said afterward, to see the shape of the darkness properly for herself, rather than lying awake imagining it. The shore was silent and black, the water beneath the ice groaning faintly with the cold, when Astrid noticed, far out across the frozen fjord, a single point of faint, silver light, hovering low and steady above the water, exactly where no light of any kind ought to have been. Here, Freydis always paused, exactly as she always paused, letting the fire crackle and pop in silence, watching the gathered children hold their breath in anticipation, before continuing in her low, warm, storytelling voice. Astrid, more curious than frightened by then, made her careful way out across the frozen fjord toward that strange, steady light, and as she drew closer, she saw that it came not from any lantern or fire, but from 3 women, tall and pale and dressed in robes the color of moonlight on new snow, seated together at the base of an enormous loom unlike anything Astrid had ever seen, its frame stretching up so high into the darkness above that she could not properly see where it ended. These were the 3 sisters the old stories call the weavers of what has been, what is, and what is yet to come, though in Solvik we have always simply called them the 3 sisters of the loom, out of a certain respectful caution about using their proper names too freely. And upon their great loom, Astrid saw, they were weaving, thread by careful thread, the whole fabric of the night sky itself, working with a patience and a steadiness that seemed, to the frightened young weaver, entirely undisturbed by the endless dark surrounding them. "You've come a long way from your warm hearth, little weaver," the eldest of the 3 sisters said, without looking up from her steady work, to stand shivering on frozen ice in the deepest dark of winter. "My village is frightened," Astrid admitted, drawing what courage she could from the sisters' calm, unhurried presence. "The sun has not returned, and our stores grow thin, and I fear we may not survive if this darkness does not lift soon." The second sister, who had not yet spoken, looked up then from her own steady weaving, her pale eyes considering Astrid with an expression that was not unkind, though neither was it especially gentle. "The sun has not abandoned your village," she said. "It is doing precisely what it has always done, and precisely what it will always continue to do, turning slowly through its own long, patient cycle, exactly as it must. But that patience is a difficult thing for frightened creatures to trust, when the darkness has stretched on so very long already." "Is there nothing to be done, then?" Astrid asked. "Must my village simply wait, frightened, until the sun decides on its own to return?" "There is one thing that might be done," she said slowly, "though it has not been attempted by any village in a very long while, and it would require more patience and more careful work than most villages are willing to offer." "Tell me," Astrid said at once, "and I will carry the answer back to Solvik myself." Freydis paused again here, always at exactly this same point in the telling, and reached for the cup of warm broth that someone in the village hall always kept ready for her at this particular moment in the story, taking a slow, deliberate sip while the gathered children waited, breathless, for her to continue. "The younger sister told Astrid this," Freydis said at last, setting down her cup and resuming her low, warm storytelling voice. "She said that though the sun could not be summoned back before its own proper time, no matter how frightened or impatient a village became, there was another kind of light that could, with enough patience and enough careful weaving, be coaxed down from the sky to help carry a village through even the very darkest stretch of winter. This was the shimmering light the old stories call the sky fire, the pale green and violet glow that sometimes danced across the northern sky even in the deepest dark, when no ordinary light should have been able to reach the earth at all. This sky fire is woven," the younger sister explained, "from threads pulled loose, now and then, from our own great loom, threads of starlight and old memory that drift down toward the earth whenever the fabric of the night grows thin enough to let them through. If your village could learn to weave with those same loose threads, gathering them patiently, night after night, into something warm and steady of your own, you might create enough light to see your people safely through until the sun's own proper return." "But how does one weave with starlight?" Astrid asked, entirely bewildered by the strange, impossible-sounding task being described to her. The eldest sister smiled then, faintly, for the first time since Astrid had approached their great loom. "The same way you weave with any other thread, little weaver. Patiently, carefully, one strand at a time, trusting that the whole cloth will eventually take shape, even when you cannot yet see its final pattern. Return to your village. Gather your people. Bring your looms out onto the frozen shore each night, and watch carefully for the skyfire's loose threads drifting down. Weave what you gather, patiently, without rushing, and trust that your steady work will eventually be enough." Freydis let the fire crackle again in the pause that followed, the children around her feet leaning forward with the same rapt attention they brought to this part of the story every single year, however many times they had already heard exactly how it would unfold. Astrid returned to Solvik that very night, Freydis continued, and gathered the village's elders together to explain what the 3 sisters of the loom had told her. Many of the villagers were skeptical, as frightened people so often are of any solution that requires patience rather than immediate rescue. But Astrid's own quiet certainty, and the desperate lack of any better alternative, eventually won enough villagers over that a small group agreed to try, carrying their looms and their shuttles down to the frozen shore that very night, exactly as the sisters had instructed. At first, nothing at all seemed to happen. The villagers sat shivering on the ice, their looms bare and waiting, watching the dark sky above for any sign of the loose, drifting threads the youngest sister had described. Hours passed in cold, uncertain silence, and more than a few of the gathered villagers began to whisper, doubtfully, that perhaps they had misunderstood the sisters' strange instructions entirely. But then, very slowly, very faintly, a single thread of pale green light began to drift down from the darkness above, catching for just a moment on the raised frame of Astrid's own waiting loom before threatening to drift loose again and disappear back up into the sky. Astrid, remembering the eldest sister's calm words about patience, did not grasp at it too quickly or too eagerly. Instead, she waited, watching carefully, until the thread settled properly against her loom's frame, and only then, slowly and with great care, began to weave it in among her ordinary threads of wool and flax. The other villagers, watching Astrid's careful, patient success, settled their own looms more properly and waited, with rather more hope now than doubt, for their own threads of drifting sky fire to appear. And one by one, through that whole long, cold night, they came, faint threads of green and violet light drifting down from the darkness to be gathered, patiently, one careful strand at a time, into the villagers' waiting looms. It took many nights. Freydis always reminded her listeners at this point in the telling, not simply one. The villagers returned to the frozen shore night after night, through the very deepest, darkest stretch of that endless winter, weaving patiently at their looms, gathering what starlight threads the sky offered them, however few or however many happened to drift down on any particular night. Some nights brought only a single thread. Others brought dozens. But the villagers, trusting Astrid's account of the sisters' patient instructions, never once stopped their steady, careful work, however slow or however discouraging the process sometimes felt. And gradually, thread by patient thread, the cloth the villagers wove together began to take shape, a great shimmering length of fabric, woven from starlight and old wool and the villagers' own steady patience, that seemed, even before it was finished, to glow faintly with its own gentle, borrowed light. When the cloth was finally complete, many long weeks after Astrid's first strange meeting on the frozen ice, the villagers gathered together on the shore one final time and raised it high above the water, stretching it out between two tall poles planted deep in the frozen ground, exactly as the sisters had instructed Astrid in a dream some nights before. And there, in the deepest heart of that endless winter darkness, the great woven cloth began to shimmer and dance against the black sky, its threads of gathered starlight catching and reflecting whatever faint light remained anywhere in the heavens, until the whole shore of Solvik glowed, gently and steadily, with a soft green and violet light bright enough to fish by, bright enough to guide the frightened flock safely home across the snow, bright enough, most importantly of all, to remind every frightened villager that they were not, in fact, entirely abandoned in the dark after all. Freydis always paused once more here, letting her listeners sit for a long moment in the warm, satisfied quiet that followed this part of the telling, before continuing toward the story's gentle close. The sun did return eventually, of course, exactly as the second sister had promised it always would, exactly as it always has and always will, turning through its own long, patient cycle regardless of any villager's fear or impatience. But the villagers of Solvik never forgot the lesson their frightened, desperate winter had taught them, about patience, and steady work, and the particular kind of light that can be woven, carefully and gradually, even in the very darkest and most frightening of nights. And it is said, Freydis finished, exactly as she always finished, her voice softening now toward the story's traditional closing words, that ever since that long-ago winter, the sky fire has continued to dance above Solvik and villages like it, every dark winter night, a gentle reminder woven long ago by patient hands, that even the longest darkness eventually gives way, thread by careful thread, to light. Freydis, as she always did at this point in the telling, allowed herself one more pause before continuing, and this time she added a detail that not every year's telling included, depending on her own mood and how much of the night remained before the children's bedtime properly arrived. Not every villager believed the work would succeed, she said. There was, among Solvik's elders that long-ago winter, a stern old fisherman named Torvald, who thought the whole business of weaving with starlight sounded like exactly the kind of foolish, wishful thinking that got frightened people into worse trouble than they'd started with. He argued, loudly and often, that the villagers' limited strength would be better spent rationing what food remained and simply enduring the darkness the way their ancestors always had, rather than wasting good wool and good hours on a task that sounded, to his practical fisherman's ear, entirely too much like a children's tale. Torvald was not unkind, you understand, only frightened in his own particular way, the way practical people often become frightened when asked to trust something they cannot properly measure or plan for. He refused, for the first several nights of the villagers' weaving, to join them on the frozen shore, staying instead in his own house, tending his own stores, watching with visible disapproval as his neighbors trudged past his window each evening carrying their looms toward the ice. But even Torvald, stubborn as he was, could not entirely ignore what began to happen on that shore, night after night. He watched, from his window, as the small group of weavers grew steadily larger, as more and more villagers, encouraged by Astrid's patient example, brought their own looms down to join the work. He watched the faint, scattered threads of sky fire begin to accumulate, slowly, into something that even from a distance had clearly begun to take on the shape and texture of a proper woven cloth. And on the 9th night of the weaving, when the gathered villagers' work had grown large enough to catch and hold a truly meaningful glow, even before the cloth was anywhere near finished, Torvald finally set down his own stubborn pride, gathered an old loom that had belonged to his late wife, and made his own slow way down to the frozen shore to join his neighbors. "I still think it a strange business," he admitted gruffly to Astrid, settling himself at the edge of the gathered weavers, "but I'd rather be strange and warm than proud and freezing, and it seems my neighbors have made rather more progress with their strangeness than I've managed with my pride." Astrid, who had grown considerably more confident over her many nights of patient weaving, only smiled and made room for him among the others, and Torvald, gruff and skeptical as he remained, proved himself in the following weeks to be one of the most steady and patient weavers among the whole gathered village, his rough fisherman's hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate, glowing threads. "It is this part of the story," Freydis told her listeners, "that I think matters just as much as Astrid's first brave meeting with the three sisters of the loom. Not every villager believed at first. Not every villager trusted the strange, slow work of patient, weaving over the more familiar comfort of simply enduring hardship the way their ancestors always had. But the work continued regardless, night after night, welcoming doubtful hands alongside believing ones, until even the most stubborn skeptic among them had been won over, not by any argument, but simply by watching steady, patient work slowly, gradually, become something real. There was one more small trial the villagers faced before their great woven cloth was finally complete, and Freydis, depending on the year and the patience of her young audience, did not always include it in her telling. But this particular long hush evening, with the children still wide awake and attentive despite the lateness of the hour, she continued on. Deep into the weaving, on a night colder and darker than any that had come before it, a fierce storm swept suddenly down off the mountains, threatening to tear the half-finished cloth entirely from the weaver's hands and scatter its precious threads of gathered starlight back out across the frozen fjord, lost forever into the wind and the dark. The villagers, exhausted already from so many long nights of careful work, might easily have given up entirely in the face of such a storm, might have gathered what remained of their unfinished cloth and retreated to the safety of their homes, accepting that their strange, hopeful project had simply failed. Many, in that first terrible rush of wind and stinging snow, very nearly did exactly that. But it was young Sigrun, a girl no older than most of the children gathered here tonight, who first refused to let go of her portion of the great cloth, wrapping both small hands stubbornly around its edge and bracing herself against the wind with a determination that startled even her own frightened parents. "We've come too far to lose it now," she shouted, over the howling storm, and one by one, shamed and inspired in equal measure by her small, fierce example, the other villagers took hold once more, gripping the great half-woven cloth together with every bit of strength their tired arms still held. They held on through that whole terrible night, the storm howling around them, the cloth straining and billowing dangerously in the wind, until, sometime near dawn, the storm finally passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving the villagers exhausted, frozen through, but triumphant, their precious cloth still whole and intact in their aching hands. It was after that storm, more than after anything else that happened during that long, difficult winter, that the villagers of Solvik understood something important about the work they'd undertaken. The Skyfire cloth was never really only about the starlight threads themselves, however precious and strange those threads had seemed on that very first frozen night. It was about the whole village, doubtful and believing alike, stubborn old fishermen and small determined children alike, holding on together, through cold and storm and long, uncertain darkness, until the work was finally, properly done. The children gathered around Freydis's feet that particular long hush evening sat quietly for a long while after the story's ending, watching the great hearth fire settle into softly glowing embers, each one privately imagining, as they always did, young Astrid's careful hands working her loom on that frozen, long-ago shore. It was the youngest child present, a small girl named Sigrid who had only heard the story told properly twice before in her short life, who finally broke the comfortable silence. "Is it true?" she asked, exactly as some child always eventually asked, every single year. "Did it really happen, just like that?" Freydis smiled, the same warm, knowing smile she offered every year to whichever child happened to ask that particular question. "That," she said gently, "is rather beside the point, little one. What matters is that the Skyfire still dances above our fjord every winter, exactly as the story says it should, and that our own village has weathered a great many long, dark winters since, patiently, thread by careful thread, exactly the way Astrid and her neighbors once taught us to. Whether it happened precisely as the old story tells it, or whether the truth has softened gently over so many generations of retelling, the lesson remains exactly the same either way. Even the darkest night eventually gives way to light, so long as we are patient enough, and steady enough, to keep weaving through it." Sigrid considered this answer with the particular serious care small children sometimes bring to questions that matter to them, and then nodded, apparently satisfied, snuggling deeper into her blanket as the hearth fire settled further into its soft, glowing embers. It had become tradition, in the generation since that long-ago winter, exactly as Freydis reminded her listeners nearly every year, for the village of Solvik to mark the passing of each long hush not only with the telling of Astrid's story, but with a small, quiet echo of the weaving itself. Each family in the village kept, tucked away carefully through the rest of the year, a small hand loom no larger than a dinner plate, reserved specifically for this one night, and on the coldest, darkest evening of every winter, once Freydis' story had properly finished and the youngest children had been carried off to bed, the older villagers would gather these small looms and make their own brief, ceremonial walk down to the frozen shore. They did not weave with actual starlight, of course, not in the way the old story described, since even the most devoted keeper of tradition understood, quietly, that some parts of Astrid's tale belonged more properly to legend than to literal practice. Instead, each family wove a single small strip of pale wool, dyed carefully with crushed lichen into the same soft green the skyfire itself sometimes showed, working together in companionable silence beneath whatever real skyfire happened to be dancing overhead that particular night, before returning home to tuck their finished strip away until the following year. It was Sigrid's own grandmother, a quiet, steady woman named Runa, who led their family's small portion of this yearly tradition, and who took Sigrid, for the very first time that particular winter, down to the shore alongside the older weavers, since the girl had finally grown old enough, in her grandmother's careful judgment, to hold a small shuttle properly without dropping it into the snow. "You'll only weave a few strands tonight," Runa told her, settling the small loom carefully into Sigrid's mittened hands as the rest of the village gathered around them on the moonlit ice. "No one expects a first attempt to look like much. Astrid herself, I'd wager, wove rather clumsily on her very first night too, before she found her proper rhythm." Sigrid, working slowly and with enormous concentration, managed, by the end of that cold, clear evening, to weave a short, slightly uneven strip of pale green wool, considerably less impressive than the neat, even strips her grandmother and the other adult villagers produced beside her, but hers all the same, made with her own small, careful hands beneath a sky that shimmered gently overhead, exactly as it had, the old story said, on that very first long-ago night of weaving. "Will it really help?" Sigrid asked, holding her small, uneven strip up for her grandmother's inspection. "If the darkness ever got as bad as it did in the story?" Runa considered the question with the same warm, thoughtful seriousness Freydis had shown earlier that evening, tucking a loose strand of her granddaughter's hair back beneath her woolen cap before answering. "I don't know that any darkness could ever get quite so bad again, little one, not with a whole village of families keeping this small tradition alive every single winter, each one adding their own small strip to the tale, generation after generation. But that's rather the point of it, I think. We don't weave because we are certain it's needed. We weave because Astrid and her neighbors taught us, a very long time ago, that patient, steady work, done together, is worth doing even when we can't be entirely certain what it's for. Especially then, perhaps." They walked back up from the frozen shore together that night, grandmother and granddaughter, Sigrid's small woven strip carried carefully between them, the whole village's collected work already beginning to blend, family by family, into the long, informal length of pale green cloth that would be added to, thread by careful thread, every winter for as long as Solvik's traditions continued to be kept. Above them, the real skyfire continued its slow, silent dance across the darkness, as if in quiet answer to the whole village's small, patient work below, and Sigrid, walking home beside her grandmother beneath that shimmering light, found herself thinking, for the first time with anything like proper understanding, that perhaps it did not matter so very much whether Astrid's meeting with the three sisters of the loom had happened exactly as the old story described it. What mattered, she thought, settling the thought carefully alongside everything else she had learned that particular long hush evening, was that a whole village, generation after generation, had chosen to keep believing in patient, steady work, and had kept weaving, together, through every long dark winter since. Now, if you happen to still be listening, perhaps your own eyes have grown just as heavy as young Sigrid's did that night, warm and settled beneath her blanket as the hearth fire burned low. Perhaps you can imagine it too, that same shimmering light rippling softly overhead, patiently woven long ago from starlight and steady hands and a whole village's quiet trust that even the longest darkness eventually, gently, gives way. Let your breathing slow, the way the whole village of Solvik slowed at last into peaceful sleep beneath its dancing skyfire. Let your shoulders soften, the way Astrid's shoulders must have softened, finally resting after so many long, patient nights of careful weaving. Let whatever darkness or worry followed you into tonight settle gently, thread by thread, into something soft and woven and steadily, patiently, turning toward light. Somewhere far to the north, in a small fjord village that may or may not still exist exactly as this old story describes it, the sky is very likely dancing tonight too, green and violet light rippling gently over snow-covered rooftops, a quiet reminder passed down through countless generations of firelit winter evenings that patience, and steady work, and trust in the slow turning of things, can carry even the most frightened village safely through its darkest night. If you enjoyed this story, Perhaps you might like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps other curious minds, and other sleepy little ones, find their way here, too, one quiet story at a time. And if you happen to still be awake, there will be another gentle story waiting for you next time, another cozy corner of an old, imagined world to drift into slowly. But for now, let your mind grow still, and let the day fall away. Sleep well, and good night.